Preach.
Well, it sure is an honor to be here this morning. If you haven't read Karla's book yet, you've got to get it because it's amazing and it's bold and she teaches while she tells. You know? I'm going to play a little music, I guess, before we get started. And that first song was a song I wrote called Satan's Complaint, which was inspired by a Sufi poem called The Conference of the Birds. This next song I'm going to sing, I don't have this one quite memorized yet. It's a relatively newer song, and it's based on this very mystical experience I had in Omaha, Nebraska. Like you do, right? Church on a Sunday, looking for some solid ground to steady me. The people were chanting over and over, going nowhere and threatening to take me. The preacher, he was so noisy, talking about things that don't lead the soul to free. Our Lady of Nebraska, she opened a side door and said, take a seat. I sat in the silence of the chapel. Soft golden light washed over me. Our Lady of Nebraska, she stood in the shadows and watched over me. The only words she spoke to me were few and spoken lovingly. She said, give me all your anger, leave it all here and then go and be free. All the frustration I bottled up inside. Our Lady of Nebraska, she took it all and then she held me tight. Our Lady of Nebraska gave me a gift unexpectedly. Our Lady of Nebraska, she took me in and then she set me free. I thought that'd be a good song for today because Karla's book deals with some of that. You can feel how, as a child, how circumstances outside of your control, how much they still affect you, how deep the effects go, how they affect future relationships, and the anger that comes up from that. And I thought that might be a song that relates well anyway. And time for at least one more. This song I'm gonna also I think relates to one of the themes of the book. I hope this is gonna be good for you, Karla. Anyway, this song I wrote way back when I was a much busier musician. I used to play Taste of Chicago every summer. And Jerry and I were at someone's house, and this song like came to me in about 30 seconds. It felt like the whole thing was right there. Can you hear me? Can you hear me cross the line? And that voice, is that your voice across the line? Hope I come in clear, 'cause I just can't get there from here. Hear that thunder roll, yeah, see that lightning snap a line. Hear that thunder roll, yeah, see that lightning snap a line. Storm, baby, that's just me breaking down inside. Can you see me? I don't know where I am. I got so sleepy, yeah. Ooh, wandered from the past. Under a golden chain, and this darkness filled my head. Can you hear me? Can you hear me cross the line? Can you see me? Yeah, I hope you get to me on time. Hope I come in clear, 'cause I just can't get there from here. Thank you. I'm going to do one other quick little song, and you really want to... Oh, and there's still people coming. All right. Yeah. Just got to tune it back up to normal. It's always like when you hear the strings going up, just waiting to hear it. Like, oh, I hope that doesn't snap. Doesn't that like give you a little anticipation? Let's see if I jinxed myself here. All right, so this next song is called Sweet Jesus Blues, and normally it's a pretty rocking number with the full band, but I think it sounds a little better slowed down. And it's just an acoustic guitar, so hopefully it still has a bit of a groove. Because it's the groove that matters, right?
Amen.
So this song is about holding on to, again, kind of childhood trauma, holding on to things and letting it affect your feeling of self-worth, and then realizing at the end you got to let it go. So it's kind of a prayer. It's like with the full band, it's like an R&B prayer, right? Just like you want. Swing your sweet chariot, where are you? Haunted by demons who rise to accuse sins of the Father, now the Son pays the dues. Let that harmonica lament and moan, make like Ulysses, lonely for home. Failed all my trials, frayed the seeds I have sown, eaten by birds and lost among stones. If you had to choose, I wouldn't choose me. If you needed saving, hope someone's closer to you than me. Don't depend on me. Help these blues go away. I'm a scarecrow all dressed in rags from the wardrobe of Dorian Gray. Put on some new threads, let go of these chains. Ba 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 ba. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Ooh, yeah. Let it go, yeah. Let it go, let it go, let it go. Let it go, yeah, let it go. Let it go, na 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 na, yeah. I think we're ready to start, right? So thanks to you again. I'm Jimmi Langemo. Thank you much for having me be a part of this. Looking forward to this next dialogue.
Good morning to Judson Memorial Baptist Church in this auspicious occasion. I am Luise Forseth, and I am pleased to be the one to introduce Karla McGray to all of you, those who don't know her very well. She and I have shared stories and held sacred our secrets for about 45 years, and I'm thrilled to know that many of those are now under public domain. When I met Karla, she was working at the Science Museum, collaborating with departments to create exhibits. She was drawn to the creative professions and spent years working in advertising, publishing, managing an art center, and museums. She honored her passions, she honed her skills. But another voice accompanied her. I believe it was instilled at the death of her mother in a new, I'm not the one who's supposed to cry at this thing, a new relationship with God. She took a walk, and on that walk, she felt an unexplainable spiritual shift take place. She writes, "My suffering cut into my soul like never before. I felt the deepest grief and the most profound peace I have ever known, as if a presence was watching over me." That presence now called her to shift her life to make the world a better place for suffering people. She needed to equip herself with more wisdom and grace, mercy, and hope. And in her 40s, she's off to cemetery. Are you sure you wanted me here? Off to the seminary to learn, experience, and dump some of her own baggage. And 29 years ago, she was ordained in this very church. God directed her in mighty ways. She moved into people's lives in their greatest need. She married and buried people unaffiliated with the church. Estranged families approached her, and ceremonies were created to bring healing. She conducted 350 plus services. Grace, mercy, and resulting hope touched hundreds of people's lives in those services. To illustrate more into her spiritual gifts, I want to turn to her time at North Memorial Hospital and Care Center, a Trauma One hospital. Karla served in many of the departments. Her work exhausted her heart, but she pressed on. She baptized dying babies. She visited women with bruises and broken bones from domestic violence who would return and return and return to the hospital. She accompanied families as they said goodbye to their loved ones and worked with people who held destructive theology. She gave them a chance, an opportunity to speak their anger and their disappointment and their hurt in God. She held hands at times with people in joy, as well as a person who may be dying alone in a hospital with only doctors and nurses as companions. But Karla would show up, the chaplain, listening and touching and providing closure in grace and mercy. Karla, would not be unusual for her to notice a whole other area of need in the hospital. She saw stress and depression on staff and in the intense and demanding hospital. Working with her two colleagues, they established the Life Work program for employees. In 1 year, they had 1,000 contacts from staff and people for support. One-to-one contact, small groups, anyway, to address these previously ignored needs. Gratefulness eased the tensions. Employees breathed. Karla organized and co-facilitated Compassionate Conversations, a New Time event. Staff would suggest topics, over 40 conversations, including topics on caregiving, parenting adult children, sexual assault, and even pet grief. People talked and they left these conversations with new friends, with feelings that they mattered, and with uplifting spirits. Karla summarized these offerings in her book when she wrote, "The combination of patient and staff care was most gratifying experience in my 50 years of working." And during this time, God kept drawing Karla to begin to paint and to write. And it took 4 years for Karla to write To Be Brave. So let us turn now to listen to Pam Joern in an interview with Karla. Pam, an author of 3 books and several plays, and to dig into the multiple miracles in Karla's gift to the world, her book, To Be Brave. Luise.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a beautiful introduction and all true. I'm thrilled to be here today. I consider it a great privilege to sit in this chair opposite you to talk about what I think is a remarkable, beautiful rendering of a very complicated, tough topic. But a book that's primarily about healing and resilience. So Karla and I are going to have a conversation, and she's going to do a little reading. And I think maybe many of you out there are familiar with the book already, but we decided we'd start with a couple paragraphs Karla's going to read, which give you pretty much an overview of the subject. I have like page 4. Yes?
1 and 4.
No, 4 and 6.
Oh, 4 and 6.
We have to get our act together. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, hello everybody and welcome. I'm so thrilled to see all of you. I can't tell you how it warms my heart to look out and see so many loving, familiar faces that involve many different chapters of my life. So, okay. So thank you. Now if I can see through my tears. As far as I know, I was the only child in our extended family who experienced domestic violence and sexual abuse at a young age. My mother chose to live with an abusive man for 5 years. She did not know he sexually abused me when she left me alone with him while she worked. She did not know he threatened to hurt her if I told. After we escaped him, I lived alone with my mother and was wary and suspicious of all men. Then when I was 13 years old, Lila shot and killed her violent husband. My mother, my aunt, and I each healed in our own way, with our own historical context, with the resources available to us. The tenor and social awareness of the times made all the difference, but the essential strand of these stories is how we resurrected ourselves, how we began life over again and strived to heal.
Okay. So, 3 different stories, really, your aunt, your mother, and you. So let's start with this. Why did you write the book? And maybe in particular, why now? Why at this point of your life?
Well, I never intended to write a book. That's the truth of the story. I carried these secrets for so long, and then I met a woman at a benefit dinner in North Memorial at a Safe Journey benefit. And something happened in that meeting when this woman came up to me and shared with me that it had been her father who was the sheriff who arrested my aunt. She heard the details as I did the invocation before the dinner. She'd heard the details of 1959, 26-year-old woman shot and killed her violent husband, and she recognized this story. And she approached me, and I was completely shocked. When that occurred, she was 12 years old, I was 13 years old. So I said to her, we had to meet and talk. And that she really was the person who opened the door to this story. And once I started digging into the story, I thought I was digging into the story of my aunt. The more I learned about my aunt, I began to put together parallels with my own mother's story. And then I began to put parallels to my own story. And so one thing led to another. Why I continued to pursue it and write it, I think once I started, it was sort of hard to stop at some level. But I wanted to write it, and now to publish it. I wanted to do it to let women who are going through these experiences or who have gone through them know that they're not alone. I wanted to bear witness to the power of secret keeping in families, the power of trauma and the long-lasting effects of trauma on women and children. And the more I wrote, the better the therapy was that I received from the writing. So I just kept going and going.
One thing that struck me as I read it, Karla, is that had you written this 20 years ago or 30 years ago, it would have been a very different book.
Completely
But
different.
you've had a long journey of discovery and healing, and you write from that place now.
Yeah, you know, when you're 75 years old, what have you got to lose?
So let's look at the reading on the larger context reading.
Okay.
I forgot to write down the page.
Oh.
You must have it.
Let me see. I do somewhere.
It's on 23.
23, okay. This was, I wrote about a visit on Palm Sunday. I was driving to northern Minnesota to meet with my aunt and uncle to talk about my aunt's experience, a conversation that hadn't been had in our family for over 55 years. And I was feeling a lot of trepidation about it, and I was sad about missing Palm Sunday service in my own church. But I got in the car and drove up to meet with them. The landscape was bland and beige. The farm fields had been turned over in the fall, waiting to be planted in the spring. The old 2-lane highway was now 4 lanes as I flew past Elk River with no glimpse of the town. Modest houses lined the highway, ATVs and pickup trucks adorned with monster wheels in their yards. A billboard boasting dancers and booze, need we say more? Was positioned just in front of the billboard for the Faith Christian Church, or Faith Christian School. Before I realized it, I had passed Princeton and Malacca. Since the freeway skirted these once familiar little towns, I realized I would have to take a detour if I wanted a piece of pie in a local cafe. A story came on the radio about Corey, a young soldier who, along with his father, was a guest of President Barack Obama at the State of the Union address. Injured by an IED in Iraq, the soldier had spent 3 months in a coma and many months in rehab. As I listened, I thought that if there was a contemporary passion story, this was it. As members of Congress gave Corey a standing ovation for several minutes, his father turned to him and said, "This is for you." Corey replied, "This is not about me, but a much larger story." This reminded me that Lila's story was a much larger story, and I was on my way to find out all I could learn.
This whole story about domestic violence is sadly a much larger story, larger context. You want to talk about that a little?
Yeah, I want to discuss that briefly. I don't know how many of you saw the article on the front page of the Minneapolis paper yesterday, but talking about how domestic violence is up 40% in the state of Minnesota. There were 2 murders just last weekend of 2 women by intimate partners and husbands. What I think we don't realize is that the domestic violence became a pandemic within the pandemic. As we were all locking down to be safe, women were being forced to lock down in the most dangerous of situations. And at the same time, the president at that time deemed gun stores as an essential service. So when there is a firearm in the home, a woman's chance of being murdered by her husband or partner goes up by 400%. So this is a national issue. It's an international issue. There's an amazing woman named Cheryl Thomas who started Global Rights for Women. She's trying to do this kind of work all over the world. But in the United States, there are probably between 10 and 12 million individuals who experience stalking, rape, assault, abuse, or murder around the issue of domestic violence. So it's something that, this is one small story in the greater scheme of so many stories that go on and on.
Yeah.
And you know, I mentioned this in the book that, I'm going to say it now because I don't know if I'll remember to say it later, but I really do believe, I mean, the preponderance of people who are the perpetrators are male. And until men start holding other men accountable for violent behavior, this will not stop. And so I'm calling upon all men to take a stand and do whatever you can. It isn't just about women.
Well, let's talk a little about your writing process. Because I know when we met, years ago, and you first started this book, it had a very different outline or feel to it. So can you tell us a little about your process as you worked through this?
It's so hard to explain that because it was sort of in fits and starts. I started, I tell the story in the book about running into Patty Houlihan, who's a neighbor and friend, and I'd taken a memoir class from her about 25 years ago, not ever imagining I'd do a memoir, but I just thought it was interesting. And she said she was interested in starting a new class called Writing as a Tool for Healing, and she was looking for a venue for it. And I called her the next day and I said, I have a venue for you. She said, where? I said, my dining room table. And so we've been meeting at my dining room table, before COVID anyway, for the last 9 years. And in that class, I began to start writing little bits and pieces of this story. And that's kind of how it evolved. I mean, I was still working full time. I didn't have time to really spend on it. I was also hesitant about writing certain parts of it. I was frightened. And so I just did it over time. Eventually, as I got farther along, I had so many bits and pieces, they were just stacked up in piles. And one time when my husband Willie was out of town, I laid them all out in the dining room and on the side buffet and everywhere, and tried to figure out what should I toss and what should I keep, and tried to make sense out of it. And I eventually decided to paperclip a bunch of the chapters together, and I put them in file folders, and I gave them to a woman named Paula Moyer, and she was maybe going to be here today. There she is. And if you'll pardon me, I know we're in a church sanctuary, but in a book by Natalie Goldberg, she called them your first shitty drafts. And so poor Paula had to wade through my first shitty drafts. And God bless her, because when I sat down with her, nobody had read any of this. And she just said, keep going, don't stop. And I shared those kinds of drafts with 3 other individuals too, Susie Whalen and Mark Berg and Sarah Evans. And they also said that, Sarah Evans said, well, you're not done. This is enough for now, but just keep going. And that really helped a lot. I have to mention, in the last year, honestly, with COVID, that was when I really had uninterrupted time to really concentrate on it. And so, fortunately, Judy Madison, a dear friend, a clergywoman friend, referred me to Beth Wright. And for anyone who's interested in self-publishing, which I knew I would do because I didn't think I'd live long enough to make it through all the rejection letters, That's Right is a rich resource for individuals who want to self-publish. And so if you want to know more about her, I'm happy to share that with you.
Okay, but you left out one step that I know about.
What's that?
I'm not surprised. No. Patricia and Cisco.
Oh,
said thanks
yes.
to you, because I know that you dived into this story initially, I think, to mostly about your Aunt Lila.
Yes. Well, I sent the very, very rough manuscript to Patricia Weaver Francisco through the Loft. The program is called Coaching and Manuscript Coaching and Critiquing. And they have various authors on their list that will do this for people. And I looked at the list and I saw her name, and because of the work that she had done around the issue of rape, I decided she would be the person I'd like to send this manuscript to. So I sent it to Patricia, and she sent it back to me and said, "You've got a remarkable story here. I know you think this is the story about your aunt, or you think this is a story about your mother, but it's really about you. And now I want you to go back and rework the whole story through your experience." So I did, and 2 years later, I sent it to her again. And God bless Luise, she said it took me only 4 years to do this book. It took me 9 years. So, thank you. I earned every one of these white hairs. But Patricia sent it back to me and said, "I think you're done. If you tweak here and there, I think you've got your book." And it was very helpful. Yes, thank you for reminding me of such an important person.
So I want to talk with you a little about your mother, who was such an important figure in your life and such an important character in the book. And particularly when I tried to talk to Karla about this weekend over coffee, I got all choked up. So we're going to see if we get through this. But when your mother died on New Year's Eve, and you were called by a neighbor, I think, who
A friend of my mother's called and said that my mother hadn't shown up for lunch that day.
And you found her body. And then what I found so tender was a very young policeman showed up, and then a young coroner's intern. And there's the future chaplain, Karla, talking to both of them who are about whether they were really okay handling this because they were new at it, and had they had any training, and how could she help them?
And the irony is we're all sitting in my mother's living room and my mother had a studio apartment. So my mother was lying right there, keeping company with all of us through this. So.
And then the piece that just really killed me was, it must have been, was it before the first person?
Arrived.
Karla took the rollers out of her mother's hair. That little scene just really moved me, just picturing you doing that, knowing that she would want to look her best.
Yes.
Even then.
Yes.
Yeah, that was,
Yeah.
I asked you to read a section, but do you want to say any more about life with Mother before you?
Well, this whole book is a tribute to her.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, like I said, when I was young, I didn't know my mother was brave. I just knew she was all I had.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Well, I asked Karla to read a section that, when I asked her to, she said, why that one? And we'll see what you think, but then we'll talk about why after. Page 19.
Okay.
This is when you...
Yeah.
Okay. You can set it up.
Earlier, when I was working at North Memorial, a cousin of mine ended up in our hospital with his young wife who had cancer. And I had spent some time with them in the hospital. And even though I'd been somewhat removed from my family for a while, when she died, I really felt I wanted to go and be with him and be with my family. I really felt called to do that. So I went to his home in Princeton, and we were all gathered out on the deck, and we were visiting. And I hadn't been with my family for quite a while, so we were having light conversation. And anyway, but I sort of felt like I was my mother's presence there because she was gone, and I just felt they were looking at me almost as if I were my mother. Our conversation had quieted down, so in my discomfort, I broke the silence. I told you that I scattered Mom's ashes on the farm, didn't I? Along the top of that hill on the far side of the pasture. Everyone looked at me but didn't say anything. I didn't know how to read their silence. She was most at home, most at peace on the farm. It just seemed natural that that's where she would want to be. More silence. Now feeling even more uncomfortable, I babbled on. The day I scattered Mom's ashes, I walked along that hilltop over beyond the windmill with her ashes in my backpack. I remember a breeze was blowing. Then suddenly a doe came out of the woods. I was upwind of her so she didn't smell me. I watched her as she loped through the meadow. Then she stopped and cocked her ears. She was copper brown and beautiful. My aunt and uncle listened to my story. Della with a wisp of a smile on her face, Sydney looking pensive, both no doubt picturing that familiar meadow. Then she just kept going, trotting along, stopping to graze now and then. It was weird. It felt like a visit from my mother. It made the moment so beautiful. I knew it was her trying to tell me it'd all be okay. My aunt and uncle stood there, transfixed. I realized I'd gotten lost in my story. I had other visits from my mother, I told them.
Yeah. So talk a little about those visits and some of your work as a chaplain.
Well, when the visits occurred, it was mysterious. It felt like part of a great mystery. I did feel that with the experience on that hillside. I had an experience where I came home one day and I felt my mother's presence in my home, and it was kind of scary. I felt like someone was in my home at first, and then I thought, well, who's here? And I was walking from the back door through my apartment, and I went into the living room, and there was my mother standing in the corner in the living room. She didn't say anything. She was just there. And then it was sort of gone. The same thing happened on 2 other occasions where I didn't see her, but I powerfully felt she was with me. And so I didn't tell a lot of people about these things because, people might think you're a little goofy. But as a chaplain, I would be sitting with people on hospice, and they would talk about seeing loved ones in the corner of the room, loved ones who'd already died. They would bring up children in their lives that were standing by their bed that had died. And so what I tried to do was allow, or just give people permission to talk about those kinds of visitations. And I think we're reluctant to bring up these kinds of things, again, for fear that people think we're a little strange. But I think if we open up our hearts and spirits to them, to people who have gone before us, it can happen. I was telling Pam about visiting on hospice one day with a couple of sons who were in their late 70s, and their mother, who was almost 100, was dying. Maybe she had died by that moment in time, but I was called to come and visit with these sons, and so I'm sitting there and I'm talking with them, and they were like 2 old bachelor farmer type guys, and I said to one, your mother has been a powerful person in both of your lives, and you never know. I mean, she may be a presence for you ongoing. And one of the sons turned to me and he said, yeah, Dad came and visited me in the garage one day after he died. And the other brother said, hell, you never told me that, So we had a delightful conversation, and suddenly the 2 brothers were on a completely different level with each other. So I think in my work in the hospital, I just tried to open that door for people.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Well, we talked a little about how people look for their own stories in a story like this. Either their disappointments or unwillingness to forgive or regrets, but also for pivotal moments and what I call serendipitous encounters. Because you had a number of those. Let's talk about a couple of the moments that, like all of our lives, or, Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken, it could have been different had just not some element happened.
Right.
Like Fern, isn't it Fern?
Yeah, Fern.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I called my mother's friend Fern, they had been farm girls together up in Aiken, Minnesota. And I called her to let her know that my mother had died. And she was the one who said, "Did your mother ever tell you about your father?" And I realized she had information, but she was afraid and reluctant to tell me the information in that first conversation. So long story short, she said, "I've got to call you back." Well, 2 weeks later, she called me back, and she'd gone to visit with a Catholic priest. And I was saying to Pam, what if she'd gone to a different priest who had given her different advice? But this priest had said to her, "The living deserve to know the truth. And this young woman is the living, so you owe it to her to tell her about her life." Had she gone to a different priest, it could have been, my whole story could have been completely different.
Right.
Coming to this church, Elizabeth Higgins invited me to a Jewish Passover dinner at this Baptist church with my Native American friend and her Irish husband. Who knew? That coming to that dinner would totally change my life. I wasn't a member of the church. Walt Pulliam was the minister at the time, and he knew that Willie and I were kind of off and on again, and at that point in time not seeing each other. And Walt called me at the Science Museum and said, "Why don't I come over and have lunch with you and hear about this new job you're thinking about taking in California?" Because I was thinking about leaving Minnesota. And he came to lunch and he said, "Well, I want to hear all about California, but first you got to tell me about Willie. What's going on with Willie?" Well, I just started sobbing at lunch. And by the time we got through lunch, he said, "Well, this job in California sounds really interesting, but I think you first have to settle this thing with Willie." And that day, I went down to the museum gift shop, bought a ring with dinosaurs on it, and proposed to Willie that very day.
I hope he still has that ring.
We still have the ring. And then what was funny is he kept looking at me and saying, "Are you sure you're not going to change your mind? Are you sure you're not going to change your mind?" So the next morning I sent flowers to the law firm where he worked, and on the card all I wrote was, "I am not changing my mind." The other pivotal conversation, and I call these moments of grace.
Yeah, sure.
The other pivotal conversation was with Lee Fable. When Willie and I went to lunch with Lee and his wife Mary Ann, and we were sitting there, and Lee's wife Mary Ann died from Alzheimer's a few years ago, and she was at the table, and this was a serious conversation because Lee wanted to tell me and Willie about finding his family, because Lee was adopted by a family in Minnesota. And he, for his 70th birthday, had gone in search of his birth family. And meanwhile, Mary Ann is bored with the conversation a little bit, so she was playing with water and she was doing various things, and we were having this serious conversation. But it was so beautiful because Lee told me all about his search. And I said to him, "When you think about it, send me the name of the woman who helped you find your family." And so not too long after that, Willie and I were in Florida, and he was off golfing one day, and I was alone, and I had nothing happening, and all of a sudden I thought, maybe I'll send that woman an email. And 3 days later, I knew who my family was. So I have Lee Fable to thank for another whole remarkable resurrection in my life.
Yes, this is about finding out about your father
Yes.
and half-sisters.
Yes.
I think you even mentioned in the book that one of them looks quite a bit like you.
Yes, there were two sisters, one 2 years younger than I am and one another 5 years younger. And the older of the two sisters already had Alzheimer's by the time I made contact with them. So I never did meet her. But Willie and I made a trip to Oregon. And, and I write about this in the last chapter of the book, but about walking off an elevator and there standing my sister with her husband. And it was sort of like looking in a mirror. When she was younger and prettier and blonder. But it's been remarkable. And we continue to stay in touch. Willie and I are looking at making some plans to go and visit them again this fall, perhaps. My Uncle John, who was my father's youngest brother, my father obviously was deceased and so were all the other siblings, but this uncle happened to be the genealogist in the family, and he was thrilled to find out about me. And so we keep up correspondence regularly, and he's quite a character, even though he's now 93 years old. So.
Well, that's one of the key pieces in the story really is that your birth father never knew you existed.
Yeah, he never knew about me.
Right.
That was one of the big secrets.
Mm-hmm.
My mother never wanted him to know, and therefore I also didn't know.
So that sort of leads us to the next little topic here, which is children in violent situations, or children where there are lots of secrets. So I think I asked you to read from page 1 and then page 39.
Okay.
The very first paragraph.
I did not know my mother was brave. I simply knew she was all I had. As a small child, I watched my mother carefully, searching her for myself. I was too young to read, so I read her before words were mine. I read her to see if I was good in her eyes. I read her to learn if the day would be okay, if we would be okay. I read her to learn that if that day she had time to pay attention to me, or if work would pull her away. I read her to learn if I was a valued, loved being in this world.
Yeah.
And the other page was
39. Starting with the I remember.
Yeah.
Yep. Now this is, something happened here.
Have we lost, did you lose your microphone?
Yeah, I think so. I'll just talk very loud.
Well, that's great.
You might want to set this up.
Okay.
What's happening here? It's at the trial time, right?
Yes. Yeah, we were getting ready for the trial, and this was, I think, the night before the trial was to begin in Brainerd, Minnesota. And the family, people had come from around the country to be there, and family had gathered, and so we were sitting around the table. I remember feeling that in that full farmhouse table, at that crowded table, there was no room for my questions or fears. My mother was busy attending to her parents and her sister. I was expected to be strong and soldier on like the rest of the family. I felt lost in the shuffle while others attended to adult business. I was hurt and alone, but I was determined that it was my job to understand and to not be a bother. Over the years, I have forgiven my mother and the other adults who were present. They were as lost as I felt. But I learned lessons during that time about not sharing feelings, about putting on a strong veneer despite my edges unraveling, about keeping on a mask of doing okay when everything was not okay. I carried these inhibiting lessons into my adulthood, along with lessons about what it means to stick together as a family, to keep commitments of love, to stand with someone in their worst nightmare. I learned all of that and more than I had words for at the time. However, all those lessons were planted deep.
Right.
Can we fix this microphone somehow?
It's working.
Travis is coming.
To the rescue.
Yeah.
Is there something I need to do?
No, it's there.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Do you want me to say something?
Well, why don't, we were just going to talk a little about kids, what it's like for kids.
Yeah.
And I have this lovely quote I was going to read, which you could read, where you say this. Let's see. Healing is the only possible.
Yeah. Healing is only possible through shedding stigmas, secrets, and shame.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think,
It's gonna pop. You say something.
okay. Great. We're on. Good job, Janet. Thank you.
Anyway, yes, I think it's heartbreaking to think of children being in situations where they have no control over what's happening, and yet I think sometimes as adults, we think we can hide what's going on from children or pretend it's not happening, or, they don't really notice because we're keeping it to ourselves, but they do know, and they're very keyed in. So I appreciated that so much in your book, that you are able to voice that now.
Well, one of the statistics that is impossible to determine is that when we talk about statistics of domestic violence, you stop and think about the number of children that violence reverberates onto and the trauma experienced by those children. And Resmaa, is it Menahem? Resmaa Menahem, In My Grandmother's Hands, writes about embodied trauma and how embodied trauma can get passed on through a family, generation to generation. And if you haven't looked at that book, it's remarkable. But I think that children do the best they can. I do remember one time when I was going into fairly deep therapy, I remember Dick Jones saying to me, some children at age 5, they die what appears to be accidental deaths, but their deaths maybe are not so accidental, because children cannot cope with the trauma that they're experiencing in their lives. So we don't want to forget the children in the midst of this larger issue.
Right. Yeah. There's also a number of grace-filled incidents in your book, grace-filled moments in your life that helped you and helped your family. And I was particularly taken with the story about the Greek restaurant during the trial. It's on page 47.
Yeah.
A reminder of how important compassion is, and how you can touch someone by something so simple, and it matters. It matters for a long time.
So my family had been going to the trial all through the Thanksgiving holiday, and now it was time for the jury to deliberate. On the day the jury began its deliberation, my family returned to the restaurant for dinner. They'd had lunch at this Greek restaurant every day during the trial. The owners already knew the dishes my family liked, so they brought out platters of food, serving family style. My family members hardly noticed they were so preoccupied. They simply ate. This meal provided a respite, a breaking of bread and communion until they had to return to the courthouse and reality. At the end of the meal, my grandfather and Sydney went to the cash register to pay the bill. The Greek gentleman looked at my grandfather right in the eye and said gently, "No, Mr. Palmer, your family has been through enough. Let us do this small kindness for you." He would not allow my grandfather to pay and insisted that my family members were their guests that evening. In this instance, the stranger provided the welcome. 55 years later, my Uncle Sidney and I cried telling me this story. Compassion and kindness are never forgotten. Yeah. And my Uncle Sidney doesn't cry. Yeah. So yeah, that was extraordinary. And of course you think about in 1959 in the town of Brainerd, Minnesota, a family from Greece was an unusual thing. So they were strangers in the community. And it was beautiful how this family welcomed my family.
Another thing I thought was remarkable in 1959, in a small town in Minnesota, a woman on trial for shooting her husband, not once but twice with a shotgun. And a number of women showed up every day for the trial.
That was incredible. When I went to the Minnesota History Center and pulled out all the old newspapers from that particular period of time, I thought it was so interesting that the reporter noted that in the articles about the trial. At one point mentioned there was standing room only in the courtroom, but especially noted the number of women who were present for my aunt. That was remarkable. The other thing I would say, this is a very small community, and there was a fundraiser also held for my family out in the country, at a place that was just sort of a little beer joint dance hall kind of place where people had wedding dances. But they threw a huge fundraiser to help my family with money for the legal fees. And the other instance of compassion was Mrs. Kruger, the woman who was married to the sheriff, and the care that she took with my aunt on the morning after my aunt was arrested. She fed her, she took care of her, she listened to her. That was also extraordinary compassion.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Good reminder to all of us.
yeah.
So Karla, you've had a remarkable life. You're remarkably whole at this point. So what helped? What got you from there to here?
Yeah.
Lots of things, but
Well, I would say in the book I recount a conversation with a dear friend on a snowy day in Ichabod's Bar in downtown Minneapolis, and that dear friend was Luise. And that was another one of those pivotal moments of grace for me, because someone named what I had experienced, which I didn't have words for. And that sent me off to going to an incest group. Never would have imagined myself in such a place. I was describing to Pam that I think one thing about personal growth is that it's almost like you can work really hard for a period of time, so you're kind of climbing, and then you sort of have to level off and rest for a while, and then you can work real hard again, and then you have to rest for a while. And so I think each of these steps, from the incest group to this church, I write about coming into the sanctuary of this church and sitting in the back pew, and I'd just sit in the back pew of this church and just cry my eyes out every worship service, and I'd slip out the door before anybody would see me at the end of worship, because I just did not feel acceptable to be in a church community. That's what shame will do to a person. And so this community was huge in my healing and feeling loved and acceptable and in the eyes of God, for example. And then when I started seminary, I had to write a paper, excuse me, for Jim Nelson, and you had to write about where your theology begins, and I realized my theology started with evil. And that was revelatory. I thought, this is telling me something. Well, that put me into deep therapy, and thank God for Dick Jones. I was with him for 2 years, and he was just remarkable and such a healing presence to me. And I also went through 5 years of spiritual direction training to learn how to pray and to learn how to be more grounded in my own life, and how to be more present to others. So these were all like steps on a ladder to putting together the pieces of the puzzle, if that makes sense.
Tell us about that little flame of righteous indignation.
Oh, yeah. I forgot that part. Thank you. Well, I was sharing with Pam that when I was about 9 or 10 years old, and I was living on my grandparents' farm every summer, there was something that happened inside me at that point in my life, and it was a kind of, and I describe it as a kind of righteous indignation, sort of anger, yearning for right. I decided I deserved better than what I had seen around me or had experienced up to that point in my life. Why that happened, why that spark happened, I have no idea. But it fueled a kind of an anger in me, which wasn't always altogether healthy for establishing trusting relationships. But it did fuel me to stand up for myself and demand to be taken seriously in whatever context I was in. It didn't always work great with some of my managers that I worked for, don't we know?
I think it is important to name that there's a role, an important role for anger.
Yes.
That it's justified anger in this kind of situation.
That's right. Anger can be a very good thing.
And women are, most of us, of a certain time at least, were schooled that anger's really not okay for women.
That's right.
So, okay. Also, your grandparents played a huge role. So I think we could turn to page 82, next to the last reading, page 82 and 83, when you are sitting at your grandparents' table.
Yeah.
And the paragraph that I think you're not going to read tells about how there's grace being said, and as a child you're sort of peeking and watching all the people at the table to see what's really going on with them during grace.
Yeah. I said I loved watching my grandma pray, her face lit only by kerosene lamplight. When we first lived with my grandparents, I had not yet been to church, but I now know that church was experienced at that table. When church was too far a drive due to bad weather or when gas was scarce, the roads were out or hay needed to be mowed that day, communion was at that table. For my grandmother, this was the body, her family. It was here that she tended wounds and brought comfort with mashed potatoes and gravy, fried salted pork, and a good piece of pie. It was here in my childhood and throughout the years she cared for her children and grandchildren and helped them bear the crosses of their lives and choices. At age 6, I began to learn this while peeking through prayer. With amen, everyone began devouring their supper with small talk of whether or what went well. That new engine part slid right into place. Damn, I like it when that happens. Or what went wrong. Brownie and Big Red went at it again in the barn as I was trying to get them into their stanchions. Had to break them up. That bad blood between those cows probably won't get resolved until one of them becomes a pot roast. I listened as Grandpa preached on the injustice of the poor prices the creamery was paying local farmers for their milk. Fear not, he declared. The Democratic Farmer Labor Party would rise again after Eisenhower. I watched and listened to all of this as a wide-eyed little girl coming to know her family. In time, I learned there was a promise at that table that no matter what life delivered, this family would gather there in warmer hands with one another. I had never known family before. I was learning that it was the ground of my being, our being. Seasons would come and go, raspberries would be picked over, holiday pie crusts rolled out, and pigs would be slaughtered in the spring. But always a prayer would be issued to the good Lord to bless us, keep us all safe, and remind us that glad hearts are still possible, even in the dark dusk of day. It was on a formica top table that I learned communion and breaking bread. Years later, as a pastor, I invited others to the communion table with these words: "Come not because you must, but because you may. All are welcome. Please come." I deeply treasure celebrating the Lord's table, for it was at my grandmother's table that I first planted the seeds of my faith and experienced the presence of something greater than our small selves, embodied in a family's love and compassion.
I think we'll look at the Okay, so Jimmy, I think we're...
You can ask for questions.
Yeah, oh yeah, thank you. have to remind each other about our planning. Yeah, our hour is almost up, but we did want to leave a little time for questions or comments if you have them out there.
And it's okay if you don't.
We've covered quite a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Beautiful job. I have a question.
Yes, here's Lynn.
Yeah,
Yes.
I was wondering, well, okay, the courage, oh, should I take this thing off? Okay. Yeah, wondering, you know, you've processed and done, and you had an incredible journey of healing and recovery for yourself over these various decades of your life. But what drove you to say, this is a story I really want to tell and put out there on paper and get published? That kind of that courage to say, to drive it forward and take the step to really do it.
I will be honest with you that even after I got it all done, I felt a lot of fear and trepidation about pushing the button to print. I was scared to death to do it. And I called Judy Madison, the friend and woman, she's in her early 80s, and she wrote a very graphic memoir about her life and her family. And I called her and I said, I am just trembling with fear about doing this, and I don't know what to do. And she said, I felt exactly the same way. She said, seek whatever support you need to be able to do it, but you'll be so grateful that you did. And so that was really important to me to be able to really take the step. Because, you know, a friend said to me a couple of days ago, I told her I was feeling anxious about today. I said, I'm very nervous about this. And she said, well, stop and think about it. You've had years of not talking about any of this, and now you're going to sit in front of a bunch of people and talk about it. And it's sort of like, oh, sure, of course that makes all the sense in the world, you know, but anyway.
Yeah, thank you.
So there is another question. And I have one more thing I want to say before we start.
This says, domestic violence personally affects more people than abortion, racism, or even climate change, and yet no major protests or parades. Why is that?
Good question.
Indeed.
Well, you know, Joe Biden signed a bill, 30 or 40 years ago, on protecting women. And they've been trying to get it expired, and they've been trying to get it signed again, moved through Congress, and it's been very difficult. And this particular bill opens up all kinds of resources for women. So very good question.
Yeah.
We have to keep taking a stand about it.
Right.
Karla,
Yeah, Jody.
I just want to thank you for writing this. I had no idea this was going on. And the light that you are shining on this helps others of us to walk into the light.
Thank you, Jody. Thank you.
She said she was thanking Karla for writing the book and said that the light she is shining on this helps others to shine light on theirs, to walk into the light. And I think that is so true. TT, did you have a question?
Yeah, at first I want to say to you just how powerful this hour has been for me. Yes. And, well, there's more things that I could say about that. But I was just wondering how these experiences that you've been through have affected your ministry and your relationship, not only with people that look like you and that are part of your circle, but for people that don't look like you, people that aren't part of your social economic sphere, and how it helps you in that relationship and the way that you do life.
Well, I would say one of the reasons I chose to go to North Memorial Hospital was because North had a wide-ranging socioeconomic community or population that it served, and also a wide-ranging cultural diversity of patients. And so that was one of the things that I really loved most about being there, is that we had an opportunity to minister to people who didn't look like we did, didn't look like me. People that were of so many different faith backgrounds, in fact. I mean, we just had the opportunity to be present with people who normally would look at us and not necessarily want us even to be present to them, perhaps. So yes, I mean, it influenced me greatly to meet women from a lot of different backgrounds who've gone through these experiences. I don't know if I can say more about that than that, but that's, I had the opportunity to go to Abbott Northwestern in Fairview, and I thought, well, I don't need to go to be with a bunch of white Scandinavians. Pardon me. I chose to go someplace where I could be with people of a wide variety of backgrounds. So.
I'm going to help Karla answer that. I'm going to help Karla answer that question too, because she has a very wide and sophisticated sense of humor and can meet with all kinds of people at that level and relax and makes those relationships happen. She is gifted with an incredible sense of humor. And laughter does bring us together, and instead of separating us.
Okay. Well, maybe this is the time.
Well, I want to just thank all of you again for coming. It means so much to me that you were here, and I want to thank Luise and Pam for doing what they did and for all the time that was spent putting in a lot of thought about readings and questions and things. It meant a lot to me, and your introduction, Luise, was beautiful. And I want to thank Jimmy, who is such a godsend. I mean, talk about a soulful man and a dear heart. This is one of them right here. And I want to thank Judson for allowing me to do this here in the time of COVID, which is complicated. But this was probably the place where I could feel the most safe, having this conversation with all of you. And I want to thank my daughter, Kate, for being here today. It means so much to me that you're here. And I want to thank Willie, who's been my gentle rock for over 50 years. Just one more quote from Nora Ephron. She says, above all, be the heroine of your life and not the victim. So go forth with that thought. Thank you so much.
Jimmy has chosen one particular song for us, if you don't mind sitting through it. And then when he's finished, Karla will be in the back to sign books. And we're going to encourage you, because of COVID, to please, if you're not waiting to buy a book and have a book signed, to move outside, and Karla will join you outside when she's finished if you want to talk to her. And because of COVID, Karla, who is the great hospitality person, said we couldn't do food or beverages. So we'll hear Jimmy's song, and then Karla and I will move, and Jimmy will still be playing, I think.
And I want to invite you to note the portrait of my grandparents in the back, and there's a photograph of me and my mother. And I also, since I couldn't do food or beverages, I had some bookmarks made, and I hope you'll take one. It's a small gesture, so thank you.
So this song, I want to give Karla just another big hand, because this book is bold. And, just another good reminder, it's not enough to celebrate diversity, it's not enough to be inclusive. We're really in this confused, polarized world. We need us to be anti-racist and anti-sexist and anti-homophobic. We have to be on purpose about it. So this song, there's a lot of lullabies in this world, and I realize there's not a lot of just wake you up in the morning kind of songs. And so the song is called Good Morning Little Baby, and I think we wanted to end with a song of hope. And this song, I think, gets us there. Good morning, little baby. Good morning, little baby. Good morning, little baby. Give us a smile. I'm glad to see you. We'll weather the storm, and down we're safe and warm. And the sun shines, so give us a smile. Let me hold you a while. I love you. Good morning, little baby. Good morning, little baby. Good morning, little baby. Open your eyes. See the sun shine. Yesterday's sorrow is past. A new day has come at last. And the sun shines. So open your eyes. See the love in mine. I love you. Good morning, little baby. Good morning, little baby. Good morning, little baby. Come take my hand. Step into the sunshine. The sky is so clear and blue. Let the light shine over you. Feel the light within you. With the grass under your feet. Know what it means to be free. I love you.